You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
We covered earlier on in the year that horrific attack, the most deadly mass shooting in Canadian history in and around Portapique, Nova Scotia. And so many questions still from this. I know that the gun control narrative was one that became very relevant with the Liberals ramming a gun control legislation that wouldn't have done anything to stop this. But now there are still a lot of questions about the motivation behind this attack. And if you believe that understanding motivation can help to prevent future such attacks, these questions are significant. A Maclean story, the Nova Scotia shooter case has hallmarks of an undercover operation. They have a bunch of anonymous sources in policing and banking saying that the fact that the killer was able to withdraw $475,000 in cash from Brink's Banking, which does not at all serve consumers directly, is typical of how the RCMP would pay informants or agents. Now, there's a lot of speculation, but they do lay out some facts of that type of banking and that amount of money that does make it a little bit of a curious transaction. Of course, then in response to this, you have the RCMP telling the Toronto Star that fears about the pandemic were what made the killer want to take out all his money, and that was that. It was no relationship with the RCMP. He wasn't an operative, an agent, an informant, or anything like that. I want to make sense of this. Joining me now is True North fellow and former RCMP officer Leo Knight. Leo, good to talk to you, sir. Thanks for coming on today.
Good morning, Andrew.
So when you saw this initial Maclean story, is your response, this is insane, or did it have the ring of truth to you?
I think, and as I said to you and a couple of other folks at True North, I said it was wild speculation. I haven't changed that opinion at all. For example, he apparently withdrew something in the neighborhood of $435,000 in this Brink withdrawal. That's a substantial amount of money, but in reality, it's not that much in terms of overall volume. You could easily set it into a hockey bag, and it would weigh about 11 pounds, 12 pounds, something in that neighborhood. So it's easily transportable. That's sort of thing one. Thing two is we don't know where the source of the money was. Did he cash in some of his lucrative properties? We know he had almost $500,000 in RRSP savings. Did he cash that in? And we don't know, and the banking records are just not open to us to try and ascertain any of those answers. Finally, if it was a situation of a confidential informant, I would have expected that information might have come out a whole lot sooner than this. There's no question that this guy had as a friend this so-called shadowy guy, Peter Allen Griffin, who's connected to organized crime and had done a stretch of prison in Alberta. And Griffin was actually the guy who cut and provided the decals for the official RCMP look on Wortman's car. And there's no question Griffin's as shady as it gets. But, and here I will insert a huge but, for him to be getting that kind of money from the RCMP, he would have had to have been an integral piece of the composition in terms of being a major player as a confidential informant. The Nova Scotia Hells Angels chapter, such as it is still in its fledgling stages. It had a chapter a number of years ago back in the 90s, but that chapter closed after a series of completely booted, unprofessional murders. The Quebec Nomads chapter took them over and disbanded the chapter and took away their patches and that sort of thing. What remains now is actually rising from the ashes, if you will, from a series of puppet gangs that were in place to handle the drug dealing and stuff like that. But they're in no way, shape, or form in the big leagues, the way the Quebec Nomads are, or the BC chapters of the Hells Angels, or anything along those lines. They're bid players who are trying to get into the big time. So I can't see the RCMP paying that kind of money, especially in as small a jurisdiction as Nova Scotia, for a confidential informant. That's just my opinion. I base that on no specific information other than my own speculation.
One of the things that the McLeans article did that I don't know how exactly I feel about it. They have this paragraph about the RCMP operations manual, which they say authorizes the police to mislead anyone and everyone with the exception of the courts to conceal the identity of confidential informants. So then what that does is when the RCMP tells people like they did to the Toronto Star that it had no relationship with Wortman, this paragraph tends to make people, the manual says they could lie about that. What's your take on that aspect of it? I mean, if they were concealing this, would they just keep concealing that?
Well, they would, Andrew. The part of dealing with a confidential informant is that person's safety, his very life, is entrusted in your hands and depends upon you to keep the secret, as it were. Reference to that particular paragraph, that refers more to giving an informant or an agent of the RCMP a little bit of carte blanche to lie, to make a dope deal, to buy stolen property or something along those lines to maintain a cover, and it really means no more than that.
How common are, because they say confidential informants and agents, so these are two different things here. What's the difference between them?
If you give me information relative to something that's going on that I'm interested in, that makes you an informant. If you offer to introduce me to that individual as part of a UCO or undercover operation, that makes you an agent because you're doing something specific. You're taking an action.
And the information that you provided a few moments ago about just the amount of money that would be at stake there, that's still the same if he were an agent instead of a confidential informant, theoretically, correct?
In theory, an agent would make more money because he's taking more risks upon his life.
But would we be talking about $500,000 for what we know about the circumstances so far?
I don't think so. Certainly not in Nova Scotia. The one case I can put to it that's sort of an equivalent involved an agent who was a bouncer in a strip bar working for a Hells Angel member, singular, specifically, and that guy was paid a fraction of that amount of money. Now, granted, that was a few years ago, but still, I think it shows that in the big leagues of Ontario, British Columbia, or Quebec, it's probably worth something. In the small town, I don't want to say Bush League, but say the embryonic starting up of a Hells Angels chapter in Nova Scotia, it's certainly not worth that kind of money.
With all due respect to your former colleagues at the RCMP, one frustration that a lot of people have had is that police are by default tight-lipped on things. And I'd say even to the point where they don't have to be. And in a lot of cases, when questions have been posed to the RCMP, they say it's early, we can't comment. It's early, it's an ongoing investigation, we can't comment. I found it interesting, though, that when this story came out about any sort of potential relationship, and again, it is all speculative, the RCMP was very quick to say, maybe he withdrew the money for pandemic-related reasons. So I did find it interesting that sort of self-preservation mentality seemed to kick in from the RCMP comms officials here, and then they started speculating about what his motivations might have been for withdrawing the money. It seemed like to deflect the attention off of them.
Well, it's classic deflect and spin, isn't it? I'm not going to apologize, and certainly don't you have to make any apologies for any allegations towards the RCMP's media relations strategy. It's abysmal, and it's been abysmal for several decades. That clearly hasn't changed. The RCMP has always been economical with information. That's just the nature of the beast. Trying to pry information out of them, even if you're working with the RCMP on a mutually interested project, it's still hard to get information. everybody is so protective of what they view as their own possession or their own domain or their own fiefdom.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to let it out. You see that in cases like this where the media and the public is clamoring. I mean, 22 people were murdered by one guy in a single night. That demands an explanation. And such as we've had from the RCMP, in my view, is woefully lacking.
Do you think that in a case like this, I mean, the old saying that dead men tell no tales, do you think that the questions will ever truly be answered in a case like this? That's the problem with these so-called lone wolf sort of attacks, is that you aren't looking at a conspiracy of sorts where you can start finding individual people that will give you pieces of the puzzle. If it's just one person, sure, maybe you can tell a bit of a story about that person and everyone said they might have had issues or red flags, but do you think you'll ever be able to truly get the full picture in something like this?
Well, I think so. The RCMP can only keep their lips buttoned for so long. There's going to be a number of coroner's inquests coming up into the deaths of 22 people, not to mention Wortman himself. The coroner in Nova Scotia will be looking very specifically at causation factors, etc. And the one thing that is very, very hard to do at that point in time, when you're laying everything bare in a coroner's inquest, is to try and hide something. And while I've seen it done in the past, usually what happens is woe betide anybody who tries to hide something from the coroner.
So just to wrap up that initial sort of McLean story here, the RCMP said that it can confirm that the RCMP was not the source of those funds as incorrectly assumed in recent media articles, unquote. So do you think that, let me ask the question in two ways here. For starters, do you think that, that's it, that should sort of end it? Or the other side of that, do you think that the RCMP, by being so unequivocal and so clear in its terms, they're basically guaranteeing there's nothing to hide? They have no relationship with this guy.
Again, I harbor no illusions about the veracity of anything that's being put forth in public. We don't know where the investigation is going. We don't know if the police are trying to put out a red herring for whatever reason to try and deflect attention from something. We just don't know. And as I say, it's all speculation. It's wild speculation. And perhaps some of it's even educated speculation, but it's still speculation, Andrew.
I think that's a great distinction. Leo Knight, True North Fellow and former police officer, thank you so much for coming on, Leo. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, even though it's early.
Yeah, that's the Leo's out on the West Coast, so he's doing us a real courtesy by joining us at this time. Thanks again.
All right, take care, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.